The restaurant was crowded that evening, filled with families, business people, and travelers enjoying a quiet dinner. Nobody expected a simple meal to turn into a scene that everyone would remember. At a small table near the window sat Manny Pacquiao, portrayed here in a fictionalized role. He was dressed simply, wearing a dark jacket and quietly enjoying his meal. There was nothing about his behavior that suggested he wanted attention. He was there for one reason, to have a peaceful dinner. Across the room, a group of 4 intimidating men sat together. Their loud voices had already attracted attention. They laughed aggressively, interrupted waiters, and seemed determined to make everyone around them uncomfortable. Their leader, a man named Victor, noticed Manny. He stared for a moment. "Hey," Victor called. Manny looked over. Victor smiled. "You famous or something?" Manny gave a polite nod. "Maybe." The men laughed. Victor leaned back in his chair. "Maybe." One of his friends whispered something into his ear, and Victor laughed even louder. "Look at this guy," he said. "Sitting here like he's important." Manny didn't respond. He simply returned his attention to his meal. That seemed to bother Victor. He stood and walked toward Manny's table. "You ignoring me?" Manny looked up calmly. "No. I'm just trying to eat." Several customers nearby became uncomfortable. Victor placed his hand on the back of the empty chair across from Manny. "You think you're better than us?" "No," Manny answered. "Then why aren't you nervous?" Manny paused. "Should I be?" A few people quietly looked at each other. Victor's smile disappeared. He wasn't used to people answering him without fear. "You don't know who you're talking to." Manny nodded. "I don't." Victor laughed. "Exactly." He leaned closer. "You should learn." Manny remained completely calm. "I'd rather not." The restaurant became quieter. One of the waiters approached nervously. "Sir, please return to your table." Victor ignored him. Instead, he looked around and deliberately raised his voice. "Everybody look at this man. He thinks he's tough." Manny didn't move. Victor pointed toward him. "Stand up." Manny shook his head. "I don't see a reason to." The gangsters laughed. They believed they had found someone who wouldn't fight back. What they didn't know was that the quiet man sitting in front of them had spent years learning something far more difficult than throwing punches. He had learned discipline. He had learned patience. And most importantly, he had learned how to remain calm when someone wanted him to lose control. Victor stepped closer. Then he crossed a line. He deliberately knocked Manny's drink onto the table, soaking part of his meal. The restaurant fell silent. Manny slowly looked at the mess. Then he looked back at Victor. His expression remained calm. But everyone in the room could feel that something had changed. And the gangsters had absolutely no idea who they were really messing with for several seconds. Nobody in the restaurant moved. Manny looked at the spilled drink on the table, then calmly reached for a napkin and began cleaning it up. That reaction confused Victor. He had expected anger. Maybe an argument. Maybe Manny would stand up and challenge him. Instead, Manny simply wiped the table. Victor laughed. "What happened?" he asked loudly. "Nothing to say now." Manny looked at him. "There doesn't need to be an argument." One of Victor's friends laughed. "He's scared." The others joined in. But the restaurant staff didn't laugh. Neither did the customers. They could see the difference between confidence and intimidation. Victor pulled out the chair across from Manny and sat down without being invited. "You know," he said, "people usually act differently when they know who they're dealing with." Manny remained calm. "I think people should act respectfully regardless of who they're dealing with." Victor smirked. "That's a nice speech." "It's not a speech." "Then what is it?" "Common sense." Victor leaned back. For a moment, he simply stared at Manny. Then he pointed toward the restaurant entrance. "You should leave." Manny looked around. "Why?" "Because I said so." Manny shook his head. "I came here for dinner." Victor's expression hardened. "You're not listening." "I am listening." "Then you're choosing not to obey." Manny smiled slightly. "Those are two different things." A few customers quietly nodded. Victor noticed. His embarrassment turned into anger. He stood up. "You think you're funny?" "No." "Then stop acting like you're better than me." Manny looked directly at him. "I've never said I'm better than you." Victor stepped closer. "Then prove it." Manny remained seated. There's nothing to prove. That answer seemed to frustrate Victor even more. One of his friends leaned toward him. Forget it, Victor. But Victor wasn't ready to walk away. He wanted everyone in the restaurant to see him as the person in control. He looked toward Manny. What's your name? Manny answered calmly. Manny. Victor laughed. Just Manny. Manny nodded. Victor turned toward his friends. Just Manny. They laughed again. But then something unexpected happened. An older customer sitting near the counter suddenly looked closely at Manny. His expression changed. He whispered to the person beside him. Wait. The other customer looked over. Then his eyes widened. That can't be. Wordlessly, he pulled out his phone. Victor noticed. What are you looking at? The customer didn't answer. Instead, he stared at Manny. Are you Manny Pacquiao? The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Manny gave a modest smile. Yes. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Victor's friends looked at one another. Victor's expression changed slightly, but he quickly recovered. So what? Manny didn't respond.
Victor pointed at him.
Being famous doesn't make you special. Manny nodded. I agree. That answer surprised everyone. Victor expected arrogance. Instead, Manny was agreeing with him. You're right, Manny continued. A name doesn't make someone better than anyone else. Victor hesitated. Then why aren't you afraid? Manny looked at him. Because being afraid doesn't solve problems. One of the gangsters stepped closer. You think your boxing career means you can handle us? Manny shook his head.
No.
Then what are you saying? I'm saying I don't want to fight you. The gangster laughed. Victor looked around. This is unbelievable. Then he made one final attempt to humiliate Manny. He pointed toward the door. Maybe the great Manny Pacquiao should go home. Manny slowly stood. The room became completely silent. For a second, everyone wondered what he would do. Would he finally respond? Would he fight? Instead, Manny simply looked at the four men. You've made your point. Victor smiled. Finally. Manny continued. But you haven't proven anything. Victor's smile faded. You don't know what strength is, Manny said quietly. Then he turned toward the manager. Please call whoever needs to handle this. Victor suddenly looked nervous. Because for the first time, he realized Manny wasn't afraid. He was simply refusing to play their game. And that made the gangsters far less powerful than they had believed. The manager immediately stepped away from the counter and made a phone call. Victor watched him carefully. For the first time that evening, the confident expression on his face began to disappear. His friends noticed it too. One of them leaned toward him. Victor, let's just go. Victor shook his head. Why? Because this isn't worth it. Victor looked toward Manny. He's just one guy. The friend lowered his voice. You don't understand. Victor frowned. What don't I understand? The older customer near the counter answered before anyone else could. You really don't know who he is? Victor looked annoyed. I know exactly who he is. No, the customer said. You know the name. That's different. The restaurant became quiet again. Manny stood near his table, calm and composed. He wasn't enjoying the attention. In fact, he looked slightly uncomfortable. He had never been interested in proving himself to strangers. Victor folded his arms. So what? He's a famous boxer. Manny looked at him. That's what I used to do. Victor laughed. Used to? Manny smiled. People change. One of the younger gangsters suddenly recognized him more clearly. He had seen interviews. He knew about Manny's long career, his discipline, his charitable work, and the difficult circumstances he had overcome. He whispered to Victor. This isn't the person you think he is. Victor rolled his eyes. He's sitting right there. Yes, the young man replied. That's exactly why I'm telling you. Victor looked irritated. But before he could answer, the restaurant manager returned with two security officers. They approached calmly. Gentlemen, one of them said, we need everyone to remain calm. Victor immediately pointed toward Manny. He started this. The security officer looked at Manny. Did you? Manny shook his head. No. The manager spoke. I have several witnesses who saw what happened. The security officer nodded. Then we'll hear from everyone. Victor suddenly realized that the entire room had witnessed his behavior. The spilled drink, the insults, the intimidation, the demands, and most importantly, Manny's repeated attempts to avoid confrontation. One of Victor's friends quietly stepped away from the group. I didn't do anything, he said. Victor looked at him. What are you doing? I'm telling the truth. Another friend nodded. Me too. Victor's confidence disappeared completely. You guys are serious? The second friend answered. We should have left earlier. Manny watched quietly. He didn't celebrate. He didn't insult Victor. He simply said, this doesn't have to become worse.
Victor looked at him.
You think you're better than me now?
No.
Then why are you acting like this? Because I don't want anyone getting hurt. Victor shook his head. You could have fought back. Manny answered. I could have. Then why didn't you? Manny looked directly at him. Because being capable of something doesn't mean you have to do it. The words silenced the room. The security officer nodded slowly. That is probably the wisest thing anyone has said tonight. Victor looked away. The manager then approached Manny. Mr. Pacquiao, I'm sorry this happened. Manny shook his head. Thank you. But let's just handle it properly. You don't want special treatment?
No.
The manager seemed surprised. Manny continued. Everyone deserves to be treated fairly, including them. Victor looked at him in disbelief. Even after everything I did? Manny nodded. Especially then. Victor couldn't understand it. He had spent the entire evening trying to make Manny feel small. Yet Manny wasn't trying to humiliate him in return. Instead, he was giving him an opportunity to walk away without making things worse. Then a security officer received a phone call. His expression changed slightly. He listened for several seconds. Then he looked toward Manny. Sir, there's something you should know. Manny nodded. What is it? The officer lowered his phone. Someone has recognized the group. Victor's face tightened. Recognized us? The officer nodded. There may be more to this situation than what happened inside the restaurant. Everyone became silent. Manny looked at Victor. Victor suddenly realized that the humiliation he had created for someone else might soon come back on him. But Manny still didn't know exactly what information the officer had received. And when the truth finally came out, even Victor's closest friends would realize they had seriously underestimated the quiet man they had tried to embarrass. The restaurant remained unusually quiet as the security officer finished his phone call. Victor watched him carefully. What did you mean when you said someone recognized us? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spoke quietly with the manager and another security guard. Victor's friends exchanged nervous looks. One of them finally whispered, Victor, we should leave. Victor shook his head. Why are you panicking? Because someone may have identified us. Victor scoffed. So what? The young man looked at him. You know exactly what. Manny remained near his table, watching everything without interfering. He didn't ask the officers to reveal anything. He didn't make threats. He simply waited. A few minutes later, the officer returned. Mr. Pacquiao, we have confirmed that some of these individuals may have been involved in previous disturbances in the area. Victor immediately protested. That doesn't prove anything. The officer nodded. That's why we're checking the information properly. Manny spoke calmly. That's the right thing to do. Victor looked at him. You're enjoying this. Manny shook his head.
No.
Then why do you look so calm? Because getting angry won't help anyone. Victor laughed bitterly. You really think you're above all this? Manny looked directly at him.
No.
I think I'm responsible for how I respond. That answer silenced Victor. The security officers continued gathering statements from customers. One witness explained that Victor had approached Manny without provocation. Another described how Victor deliberately knocked over Manny's drink. The waitress confirmed that Manny had repeatedly tried to avoid an argument. Every statement made Victor's position weaker. Then something unexpected happened. A young employee approached Manny. Can I tell you something? Manny nodded. The employee lowered his voice. I recognized you before anyone else. Manny smiled. Thank you. I used to watch your fights with my father. Manny smiled again. That means a lot. The employee glanced toward Victor. I couldn't believe they were treating you like that. Manny looked at him. Don't focus on who I am. The employee looked confused.
Why?
Because the lesson shouldn't be that they shouldn't have disrespected me because I'm famous. Manny paused. The lesson should be that they shouldn't disrespect anyone. The employee nodded slowly. Victor heard the words. For the first time, he seemed genuinely thoughtful. Then the manager approached the group. There's another issue. Everyone looked at him. Some customers had decided to leave because they don't feel comfortable. Victor's expression changed. He suddenly realized the consequences weren't limited to himself. His behavior had affected everyone. Families had been disturbed. Employees had been frightened. Customers had lost their peaceful evening. And all because he wanted to prove he was powerful. Manny looked at Victor. This is what happens when you use fear to control a room. Victor frowned. What do you want me to do? Take responsibility. Victor looked down. The answer seemed almost too simple. You could destroy me if you wanted. Manny shook his head. I don't want to destroy you. Why not? Because I don't know you well enough to decide what kind of person you can become. Victor stared at him. That response was completely different from what he expected. Most people Victor had intimidated either became angry or frightened. Manny was doing neither. He was treating him like a human being who had made serious mistakes. One of Victor's friends finally stepped forward. I'm sorry. Victor turned.
What?
The man looked toward Manny. We shouldn't have followed Victor. Victor's face tightened. You're blaming me? The friend shook his head.
No.
I'm taking responsibility for myself. Another gangster nodded. Me too. Victor looked around. One by one, the people he had expected to stand behind him were stepping away. He suddenly realized that fear had never created loyalty. It had only created temporary obedience. And the moment fear disappeared, so did the people who pretended to respect him. Manny quietly said, That's the difference between fear and respect. Victor looked at him. What difference? Fear makes people stay until they find a way out. Manny paused. Respect makes people stay because they actually want to. Victor lowered his eyes. The security officer then explained that the incident would be documented and handled through the appropriate process. Manny nodded. That's all I want. Victor looked surprised. That's it. Yes. You don't want revenge?
No.
You don't want to use your connections? Manny smiled. I don't need to. Victor shook his head. I don't understand. You don't have to understand everything tonight. Manny sat back down. Just understand that you made a choice. Victor remained standing. And now you choose what happens next. The words stayed with him. The authorities eventually arrived to formally review the situation. Manny gave his statement without exaggeration. He never mentioned his fame as a reason for special treatment. He simply described what happened. When everything was finished, Victor stood near the entrance. Before leaving, he turned toward Manny. Why didn't you fight me? Manny answered calmly. Because winning a fight wouldn't have taught you anything. Victor looked down. And what did this teach me? Manny smiled faintly. That strength isn't about how many people you can intimidate. Victor nodded slowly. And what is it about? Manny answered. Knowing when you don't have to. Victor walked out of the restaurant quietly. But the story wasn't over. Because the next morning, Victor would discover just how far the consequences of that evening could reach, and why Manny's decision not to seek revenge would make a much bigger impact than any punch ever could. The next morning, Victor woke up expecting the entire incident to disappear. He had spent years convincing himself that problems could be solved by intimidation. If someone challenged him, he pushed harder. If someone refused to listen, he made them nervous. And if someone embarrassed him, he found a way to embarrass them back. But this time was different. There were witnesses. There were statements. And there was a man named Manny Pacquiao who had refused to respond with anger. Victor couldn't stop thinking about that. He arrived at a small office later that morning with two of his associates. The situation was being reviewed, and they were asked to answer questions about what had happened. Victor tried to remain confident. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. One of his associates looked at him. No, Victor. We caused it. Victor turned sharply. What did you say? The man remained calm. We caused it.
Victor stared at him.
You're supposed to have my back. I did. Then why are you talking like this? Because having your back doesn't mean lying for you. The words hit Victor harder than he expected. For years, people had agreed with him because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. He had mistaken that silence for loyalty. Now, for the first time, someone was telling him the truth. Later that day, Victor returned to the restaurant. Manny was there again. He was sitting quietly at the same table, speaking with the manager. Victor stopped near the entrance. For a moment, he considered turning around. Instead, he walked inside. Manny noticed him. Victor. Victor nodded. Can I talk to you? Of course. Victor sat down. I've been thinking about what you said. Manny waited. You said I should take responsibility. Yes. I don't know how. Manny smiled slightly. Start by not making excuses. Victor looked down. I was angry. That explains your behavior. Victor nodded. But it doesn't excuse it. Correct. Victor took a deep breath. I thought everyone in that restaurant was afraid of me. Manny listened. Then I realized something. What? They weren't respecting me. Victor paused. They were waiting for me to leave. Manny nodded. That realization can be painful. Victor looked at him. Did you ever have to learn something like that? Manny smiled. Many times. Victor seemed surprised. You? Of course. Even with everything you've accomplished? Manny nodded. Especially then. He explained that success could easily create pride if a person wasn't careful. The more people recognize you, Manny said, the more important it becomes to remember that you're still responsible for how you treat ordinary people. Victor looked thoughtful. I wanted everyone to know I was powerful. And now? Victor sighed. Now I think I was trying to convince myself. Manny didn't respond immediately. That silence gave Victor room to think. Then Manny said, You don't become stronger by making another person feel smaller. Victor nodded. Before he could say anything else, one of his former associates entered the restaurant. He looked toward Victor. I came to apologize too. Victor looked surprised. To Manny? The man nodded. And to the staff. He turned toward the manager. We shouldn't have treated your employees that way. The manager accepted the apology cautiously. Then the man looked at Manny. I'm sorry. Manny nodded. Thank you. Victor watched the exchange. Something was changing. Not because Manny had threatened them. Not because he had used his reputation. But because he had shown them a different definition of strength. Later that week, Victor and his associates were required to participate in a community accountability program as part of the consequences surrounding the incident. Victor initially hated the idea. He believed it was humiliating. But during one session, he listened to a man describe what it felt like to be intimidated by people who believed fear gave them power. Victor sat quietly. For the first time, he heard the story from the other side. He realized that the behavior he had called confidence had made other people feel helpless. After the session, Victor stayed behind. I understand now, he told the counselor. What do you understand? I thought being feared meant I mattered. The counselor asked, and what do you think now? Victor answered slowly. I think being respected means people don't have to be afraid of you. Meanwhile, Manny continued living his life normally. He didn't constantly remind Victor of what happened. He didn't demand public praise. He simply allowed Victor to make better choices. One afternoon, Victor asked Manny a final question. Why did you give me another chance? Manny looked at him. I didn't give you a chance. Victor frowned. You didn't.
No.
Manny smiled. You gave yourself one. Victor remained silent. Manny continued. My job wasn't to decide who you would become. That decision belongs to you. Victor nodded. For the first time in years, he understood that accountability wasn't humiliation. It was responsibility. And responsibility was the beginning of real change. The men who had entered the restaurant believing they could humiliate anyone they wanted were now learning something completely different. Fear could make a room quiet, but only respect could make people listen. And Manny had never needed to raise his voice to prove it. Over the next several weeks, Victor's life began to change in ways he never expected. At first, he attended the community accountability program because he had to. He sat quietly during meetings, answered questions when necessary, and left as soon as each session ended. But slowly something changed. He started listening. He heard stories from people who had been intimidated by men like him. Some had been afraid to speak up. Others had changed their routines simply to avoid confrontation. Victor realized that the behavior he once considered powerful had actually made other people feel unsafe. One afternoon, the counselor asked everyone a simple question. "What does strength mean to you?" Victor stayed silent. Then he finally answered, "I used to think strength meant making people afraid." The room became quiet. "And now?" the counselor asked. Victor thought for a moment. "Now I think strength means having control when you're angry." The counselor nodded. Victor continued, "Anyone can lose control. Not everyone can stop themselves." That was the lesson Manny had taught him without ever giving him a lecture. Meanwhile, Manny continued his normal routine. He didn't seek attention for what had happened. He didn't post about Victor. He didn't tell people how easily the situation could have become something worse. He simply moved forward. One evening, Manny visited the same restaurant. The manager greeted him warmly. "Good to see you again." "Good to see you too." The waitress smiled. "We're glad you're comfortable coming back." Manny nodded. This place wasn't responsible for what happened. As they spoke, Victor entered. This time he wasn't with his old group. He walked in alone. He approached the manager. "Can I help with anything?" The manager looked surprised. "Actually, we could use some help carrying those boxes." Victor nodded. "I'll do it." Manny watched from his table. He didn't say anything. Victor carried the boxes into the storage area and returned. Then he approached Manny. "I wanted to tell you something." Manny smiled. "Go ahead." "I almost didn't come back here." "Why?" "Because I was embarrassed." Manny nodded. "That feeling can be useful if you learn from it." Victor looked down. "I realized something. I wanted to humiliate you because I thought it would make me look powerful." "And did it?" Victor shook his head. "No." "What did it make you look like?" Victor gave a small, embarrassed smile. "Someone who couldn't control himself." Manny nodded. "That realization is important." Victor sat across from him. "I still get angry. Everyone does. But now I think before I act." Manny smiled. "That's progress." Victor looked toward the restaurant entrance. "Some of my old friends still think I've changed too much." Manny shrugged. "Change often makes people uncomfortable. Should I care?" "You should care about becoming better. You don't need everyone's approval." Victor nodded. For a moment, they sat quietly. Then Victor asked, "Do you think I'm forgiven?" Manny looked at him carefully. "Forgiveness isn't something you demand." Victor listened. "You earn trust through consistent actions." Victor nodded. "I understand." Months earlier, Victor had entered the restaurant believing that fear gave him control. Now he was learning that control over others was nothing compared to control over himself. And Manny's greatest lesson wasn't about boxing. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about courage. It was about character. The ability to remain calm when someone tries to provoke you. The ability to walk away when your pride tells you to fight. The ability to accept consequences without blaming someone else. And the ability to recognize that another person's dignity is not yours to take away. One evening, Victor stood outside the restaurant with Manny. "I used to think you won that night because everyone found out who you were." Manny looked at him. "And now?" Victor smiled. "I think you won because you never needed to prove anything." Manny nodded. "That's the point." Victor looked toward the city lights. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." "You understand it now." Victor smiled. "That's what matters." Manny shook his hand. "Keep proving it." As they parted, Victor walked away with a different understanding of strength. He had once believed the most powerful person was the one everyone feared. Now he knew better. The strongest person is often the one who has the power to hurt someone, but chooses self-control instead. And the final lesson would come when Victor had to decide whether the change inside him was real, even when nobody was watching. Several months had passed since the night Victor and his group walked into the restaurant believing they could intimidate anyone they wanted. The incident had become a distant memory for most people. But for Victor, it had changed everything. He was no longer the man who needed everyone to be afraid of him. He still had a temper. He still made mistakes. But now, when anger rose inside him, he knew how to stop before making another bad decision. One afternoon, Victor returned to the same restaurant. Manny was sitting near the window, quietly drinking coffee. Victor approached. "Can I sit?" Manny smiled. "Of course." Victor sat across from him. For a few moments, neither said anything. Then Victor looked around the restaurant. "I remember the first time I sat here." Manny nodded. "You weren't very relaxed." Victor laughed quietly.
No.
"I thought I owned the place." "You thought fear gave you control." Victor nodded. "I did." He looked at Manny. "But I understand now." "Understand what?" "That night, I thought I was humiliating you." Manny waited. Victor continued. "But you never looked humiliated." Manny smiled. "I wasn't." "Why?" "Because someone else's behavior doesn't determine my worth." Victor sat quietly. That sentence stayed with him. He finally said, "That's what I was missing." Manny nodded. "Most people spend too much time trying to prove themselves to others." Victor looked down. "I spent years doing exactly that. And now I don't care as much." Manny smiled. "That's progress." The waitress brought their coffee. She looked at Victor and smiled. "Good to see you again." Victor thanked her. There was no fear in her expression anymore. That small moment meant more to Victor than he expected. He realized that respect wasn't something he could demand. It was something people chose to give. And it could only be earned through consistent behavior. Before leaving, Victor stood. "I want to thank you." Manny looked up. "For what?" "For not becoming angry enough to destroy me." Manny shook his head. "I didn't save you." Victor smiled. "No. You chose to change." Victor nodded. "That may be true." Manny continued. "But remember something." "What?" "Never wait for someone powerful to teach you how to behave." Victor understood. "You mean I should respect people even when nobody important is watching?" "Exactly." Victor smiled. "That's probably the hardest part. That's why it matters." Victor extended his hand. Manny shook it. The two men went their separate ways. And that was the real ending. There was no dramatic revenge. No public humiliation. No final fight. No celebration. The man who had once tried to embarrass Manny had learned something much more valuable than fear. He learned accountability. He learned patience. He learned that strength isn't measured by how many people you can intimidate. And Manny had proven something equally important. Real strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly at a restaurant table. Sometimes it refuses to answer an insult. Sometimes it chooses to walk away. And sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to become the person your opponent expects you to be. The gangsters had entered that restaurant thinking they were dealing with an ordinary man they could humiliate. They were wrong. But not because Manny was famous. Not because he was a legendary fighter. Not because he had the ability to defend himself. They were wrong because they completely misunderstood what true strength looked like. Manny's greatest advantage wasn't his fists. It was his discipline. It was his ability to remain calm under pressure. And it was his decision to treat even difficult people with dignity while still allowing them to face the consequences of their actions. That night, the gangsters wanted to make Manny feel small. Instead, they exposed their own weakness. And the lesson they received was simple. You don't become powerful by making others afraid of you. You become powerful when you can control yourself, respect others, and choose wisdom when anger would be easier. If this story reminded you that real strength comes from self-control and character, comment strength below. And remember, never judge a calm person as weak. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who understands his own strength the best.